Do you know the difference between a miserable person and a person living their best life? Both of them have problems, but the thing that separates them is how they interact with those problems. But problems are problems. How can problems possibly be the solution to my problems that could get me ahead of 99% of people? Well, let's see. And to figure that out, we need to first understand what is a problem. At its core, a problem is a question or a set of questions, and once those questions or set of questions are answered, then the problem is solved. At its most basic form, that's what a problem is. So for example, if I'm stupid, how do I get smarter? If I'm weak, how do I get stronger? A question. Or an even more complex one is like, how do I solve homelessness? Well, that's a lot of questions. It's like, where do these homeless people go? Why are they homeless in the first place? How can you actually help the current homeless people? And of course, many, many more questions, which is why it's very complex. And to make this even more simple and really break down what a problem is, I want to represent a problem as a box with a question mark inside. So the question mark inside is sort of representing the questions inside the problem, and the box is sort of like the problem itself. So looking at this box, it has different qualities, or problems have different qualities. First is whether the problem is known or not. So if you think about it, problems can be known or unknown. If the problem is unknown, it is something that is affecting your life, most likely negative, but you don't know it exists, therefore, of course, you can't solve it. And you don't know what it takes to solve it, you don't know the questions that are inside. And then you can imagine that as the opacity of the box, how transparent it is. But then, now once that problem is known, so it's fully apparent, then it becomes a known problem. A problem that you know. And a known problem has a difficulty. And you can break the difficulty down into multiple components, and that really shows what a problem is. First is the size of a problem, then the complexity and the thickness, and I can show this with the boxes. So if you first take a look at size, and you can see the increasingly larger boxes. If you have a very small box, then it only affects a small amount of people. And if you have a larger box, of course, maybe it affects a couple more people, and a very, very large box could potentially affect an entire country. So it's like the actual impact to people of your problem. And now in taking a look at complexity, you can see these boxes with increasingly more question marks. The simple problem or the very low complexity problem has one question mark. So it's like one question that needs the answer to solve that problem. Or if it's more complex, you need 2 questions or 3 questions or more. And then the last part, thickness. You can think of this like how difficult each of the questions are to answer within that problem. Because of course, some questions are more difficult to answer than others. Okay, so that's what a problem is. But you want to be ahead of 99% of other people. You don't want to be just like everybody else. You want to really improve your life and truly be able to help other people if needed. How do problems actually fit into that? How do problems fit into what you want? Well, problems fit into that because essentially, as I mentioned, this is a problem that can be solved that has a solution. Because fundamentally, in order to get what you want, that's a problem. And a problem can be solved. So there's questions to be answered that are not answered. So what does this really mean? And why would you want more problems? Well, so far we know that pretty much everything comes down to a problem. Problems come down to questions that have solutions. And problems have varying difficulties that can be broken down into different components. But there's actually another part of this, which is the reward part. What happens after you actually solve the problem? So, I mentioned that these problems were represented as boxes, just boxes with question marks. But now you can actually think about these boxes like loot boxes. Like once you solved, they have some loot inside that you can get. For example, if your problem was, I have no money, and then you eventually solve that problem by getting a job, or you sold something that you had to get money. You solved the problem, and then the reward you got was the money. But if you can imagine, if your problem was, I don't have a car, I want a car, but I have no money, but then you eventually solved that problem and you got the car, then your reward is essentially the car. Or you could say a house, which is, of course, a bigger problem because it requires more money. It doesn't have to be just money. But as you can see, the more difficult the problem becomes, the reward also increases. So with varying difficulties, you also have varying levels of rewards. But not only that, once you solve a problem and then you get the loot inside, you also unveil more problems. So you unlock more problems by solving a problem on top of getting the loot the reward. So let's really break this down. If you just look at the reward part for now and forget about the unveiling more problems, you can bring it back to the dimensions of difficulty. If you take a look at complexity, you can think of that like, since there's multiple questions in there, each of those questions that you answer is almost like a mini reward. So the complexity of the problem increases the quantity of rewards that are inside. For example, if your problem is, I want to get shredded, then the questions are, how do I eat better? How do I work out to get bigger muscles? And then how do I lose fat? Once you solve those problems, now you're getting the different rewards from each of those questions. Like now you have better nutrition, better health, lose some fat. Now you bigger, stronger muscles, you look better. And then once you lose the fat, like, okay, of course now you're starting to look shredded. And then if you take a look at the size component, and if you remember, that's basically the number of people the problem affects, then if it only affects you, of course, like, okay, you get the benefits for yourself. But now if you take a look at problems that are bigger and affect multiple people, that's essentially like mutual benefit. And the more and more people it affect, and you're starting to create value with other people, and you get value from this sort of reputation that you build from solving these types of problems, and really start to build your network. On thickness, these are how difficult the individual problems are to solve inside. Sort of as I mentioned before, if the problems are very difficult, then they generally have bigger rewards. For example, if your problem is you can't sleep, then the question is, how do you get better sleep? Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, because maybe you need to take certain supplements, maybe you need to get sunlight at a certain time, or maybe you're not falling asleep at the correct time that you should that matches your circadian rhythm, for example, or there's some sort of nutrition that you're not getting that's not allowing you to fall asleep and stay asleep well. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but once you solve it, you sleep better, and then basically every single day you live feeling better in life. So the thickness is like the juiciness of the problem, the juiciest of the loot inside. It's like if you think about a game and you got loot boxes, then it's like the rare loot's in there. If it's more difficult, if it's a thicker box, you got the rare loot inside. So that's the reward component. Now onto the unveiling more problems part. So if you solve a problem, you get more problems out of it. So for example, if your problem is, I'm weak, I can only curl a 10-pound dumbbell, but I want to be able to curl a 20-pound dumbbell. And you eventually solve that. Your solution was like, oh, I work out every single day and I do curls, and now I can curl that 20-pound dumbbell. But now you realize that, oh, my bicep is actually still small. So that's another problem. Now I want to curl a 30-pound dumbbell. So that's another problem. But then maybe you realize like, oh, my now bicep is so much larger than my tricep. So that's another problem. Or like, oh, now my arms are big, but my legs are weak. So you unlocked all these problems, new problems. But the thing with these new problems is that these problems are actually more difficult. But as I mentioned with difficulty, since now you got more problems from solving that one problem, and now these are more difficult, these problems now have rare loot inside, potentially more complex, or influence more people depending on what the problem is. So putting together the reward part and the unveiling more problems, by solving problems, you continuously get more problems, and these sets of problems get continuously more difficult, therefore have continuously rare loot or better rewards from solving each of these problems. So eventually, from solving more and more problems, you'll get an increasingly exponential amount of problems with also increasing loot inside. So as you continue to have more and more problems and more difficult problems, and you continue to solve them, you get more and more of the loot, which of course increases the quality of your life. If the goal itself wasn't just to get the loot, you have some sort of larger goal, then now you can take that loot that you gained along the way and use it to solve even more problems. You can imagine how this starts to compound, and your life gets continuously better and better, and with the skill of solving the problems and the loot on top of it, you begin to solve the more difficult problems just as easy as the easier problems, or the less complex, or the smaller. But you have access to so many more options, or so many more loot boxes or problems. Whether it's the loot inside or the difficulty, the satisfaction from solving the problems can potentially be unlimited. But some of you might be thinking, well, I don't really think I have any problems. And this might be the hidden component that I talked about previously coming into play. You might have a lot of problems, but you just don't see them. They're transparent to you. And you could fall into 3 different camps. It's either you're completely ignorant and like the average person who's just waiting there for somebody to come and solve all their problems that they don't even realize that they have themselves. Hand them the rewards, the loot on a silver platter. Miserable with their life because they have all these unknown problems and never get any loot and are never really able to solve any of their own problems. But I don't think that is you. And the second camp is someone who legitimately has no problems. Somehow they've solved every single problem in their life. They have everything they ever wanted. They're like a monk or like a super successful business person. But I don't think that's you, and maybe some of these people don't exist in the first place. What's most likely happening to you is you actually know that your problems are there, so you sort of see them, and you want to solve those problems, but you just don't know where to start. And you potentially don't know where to start because you're just looking at too big of a problem without breaking it down. So like too complex, or too much size, or too much thickness. So it's way too difficult to actually see the individual answers, or really see the problem as a whole in the first place, to start to get the loot inside. So the question becomes, okay, how do I actually solve these large problems then? Because I want to get ahead of 99% of people. This is a very, very large problem, but of course I don't know where to start. Where do I start? How do I use this knowledge of what a problem is and actually start to improve and solve different problems, or see problems in a way I can actually solve them? So you have this big, huge problem, so you can represent it as a huge box with a ton of question marks and maybe a little bit transparent, huge, thick walls, and it's of course absolutely massive. Starting with the difficulty component of it. If you take a look at complexity, I think this is where you should start. You can see that this huge problem that you're trying to answer, getting ahead of other people, has all these different question marks, but you don't have to look at it in the context of this huge problem. You can actually break it down into one little problem. So pull the question mark out of that huge box and make it a little tiny loot box and just focus on that. And that what that allows you to do is, of course, since it's not that big of a problem, much easier to solve, just one question. And then since you're breaking it out, that also changes the size and thickness. So now that it is one question, most likely it probably only affects you. And the thickness of that wall, okay, yeah, it might vary in difficulty, but it's much less thick than that absolutely massive problem. So with complexity, if it's too complex, you want to break down the problem. If it's too big, then you want to start with a smaller problem that could potentially start with a smaller problem first, then you can tackle the bigger problem later. So look for a prerequisite if the problem is too big or the size is too big. And if the problem is too thick, then you likely need to take a look at all the different problems that you have. What are all the options once you've broken it down to the individual little questions, little problems, and start to prioritize. Like, okay, I think the reward in this question would be really good, but like, oh, look how thick this box is. Very, very hard to answer. And like the effort to reward is very low. But look at this box. Yeah, the reward's not that big, but look at that super thin wall. I could like just quickly solve this problem and then get the reward out of it, which is pretty good. So to start is first take a look at your massive problem, break it down into a very small one, or a bunch of very small ones, and then sort it, or pick out the ones that are small and really only affect you, so it's much easier to solve. And then you take a look at the thickness of each of the boxes and pick the one that you think has the highest reward to thickness ratio, essentially, or reward to effort, and you go with that problem and you just completely focus on it until you solve it. And then you can start to move down the line and start to tick off the the larger or thicker problems, because now you, as I mentioned, you have the loot from that previous problem that can help you along with cracking open the other boxes, solving the other problems. And the transparency of a question, so whether it's hidden or not, that part is if it's a much larger question, a very, very complex, huge problem. Once you pull the little question out, that little part might be actually very, very concrete. You can see it very clearly. As for some other parts in that very, very large question are completely transparent, which you can't see. So just start with the ones that you know right now. But what does this look like? How does this actually affect you? Well, there's actually a hidden portion of this diagram. Like, this is only looking at problems in isolation. You have to bring yourself into the diagram as well. And I like to think of it sort of like a game. You start in the game, say you're level 1, and you have a problem to get at like the top charts essentially. You want to get to ahead of 99% of people. So in the game, of course, you'd have to level up. Same with real life. And then if you think about problems as like the different opponents or monsters that you battle in the different, like the beginner zone or the medium level zone or the high level zone, you go through, you battle the monsters, or you solve these like easier to harder problems, and then you get the loot, and the loot helps you along the way as you journey across the more difficult zones to eventually get ahead of the other people and, improve yourself. But not only the loot, you also get the experience from, say you fought the monster, you fought the opponent, and you won. You get that experience to make it easier for yourself to fight the more difficult monster, or for you to solve the more difficult problems. So from solving the more difficult problems, you get the help from the loot itself, and also now you're leveling up, you get the help from your actual experience to solve the even more difficult and of course hopefully more rewarding problem. Also, imagining it like a game, you can go through the different zones and then stop at a certain point if you're satisfied with where you are, and most people they never really venture out of like the beginner zone, or they stay stuck in the mid-tier zone, but you want to reach the high level zone. You want to get ahead of everybody else, and you're able to do that because of this effect of both leveling up and getting all the loot. You start to battle stronger and stronger monsters that are more and more abundant to allow you to pick and choose the loot that you want. That's of course getting more and more rare, and you're also getting higher and higher level. That actually makes it even easier for you to beat the stronger and stronger monsters, versus the person who just ignores all the problems and stays where they are. Of course, it would be impossible for them to even attempt to challenge some of these harder opponents, harder problems. So of course, you can be just mediocre and stay in a certain zone and solve those lowly problems, and never really and be ignorant to the problems that you see. Let them be transparent, or you can see the problems and really reap the rewards from solving them. And if that's you, then of course you might be still wondering, problems are still problems. It's still hard to visualize how this can be good. Well, if you take, for example, and you put this entire thing together, both the qualities of problem itself, the rewards segment, and also the you yourself getting experience and leveling up portion, to now give some examples. Say if you're low confidence, you really don't think you can do anything, you don't know what's out there, don't know where to start. By solving these smaller problems and continues to solve problems, you reinforce in your mind that you're a problem solver, that you can do it, and you start to shatter these limiting beliefs that essentially just in your mind is what keeping you down. And then once you start to lift these limiting beliefs in your mind, you're able to tackle harder and harder problems that have more reward at the end. And say if you're stupid, also in your brain, once you start to solve problems, it starts to reinforce like the problem-solving neurons in your brain to eventually tell you that you're a problem solver, that you can solve problems. It builds in these networks that allow you to solve more and more problems easier. And say if you want to make 100K, but you are able to solve the problem of making 50K. So now that 100K is not 100K away, it's just 50K away. So you just have to do the same thing again. But since you got the experience and then, the loot of the 50K, it becomes much easier to get to that 100K. The skills in the loot allow you to more easily confront the more difficult problems. Or say if you have low attention span, you're always distracted by little things, you're always tired, you have no energy, anything that you try to do that's good for yourself to solve a problem, you're always bored. This will also fix it, because once a problem is relatively complex, it becomes engaging. You start to solve the problems, and of course, in your brain, you get the benefits of becoming a problem solver, and you get these rewards along the way. You get the satisfaction from solving each of the problems, and then you can also, Andrew Huberman mentioned something like this, if you're able to anticipate the big reward at the end of the problem, you can almost take some of the dopamine from that large reward that you're expecting at the end, and it will give you motivation. It will drive you to be able to solve that problem. It'll sort of give you energy to solve that problem in anticipation of the reward. So by realizing and seeing these problems as loot boxes to be unlocked, it also gives you the motivation to solve the problems itself. So it's literally scientific, talked about by Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist, if you haven't heard of him. So you build the ability to distribute dopamine from the loot at the end, giving you the ability to tackle the more long-term gratification type of problems, which generally have better loot at the end, and give you more experience, level up your problem-solving skill more. So with all that, what do you think? Do you want no problems, or do you want more problems?